Let's say you have some animation that you want to modify, whether it's mocap animation you've imported or it's a new animation track you created by blending and combining other existing tracks like we did in the last module. Rather than going back to a DCC tool to make the modifications, you can make the edits with the control rig in Sequencer. So right now, I just have a skeletal mesh with animation set up in Sequencer. And we'll be working with the animation that we created in the previous module, where this character starts by jogging, and then stopping, and then starting a conversation with someone. And so we'll actually go through a couple different ways to use Control Rig to edit animation. So in this first example, we don't have this character already set up with a Control Rig. And actually, let's pretend that we don't actually already have this Control Rig set up that has this logic and this rig graph, including this backward solve logic. Let's just pretend we don't have that at all. You can still tweak the animation by using the engine's FK Control Rig. So in order to do that, right-click on the skeletal mesh and go to Edit with FK Control Rig. When this menu comes up, you want to make sure to uncheck Reduce Keys. And this is because we want to make sure that we maintain and preserve the quality of the animation. So go ahead and click on Bake to Control Rig. And now you can see when I expand this, I can see every single bone of the skeleton, and it has a keyframe on every single frame. So when I'm making edits to this animation, I'm actually making edits to keyframes that are set on the bones. So let's say in this example, I want him to actually be tilting his head down as he's running. And maybe that also will explain why he kind of stopped short because he didn't see where he was going. And it turns out to be a friend who he starts having a conversation with. So what I can do is I can kind of come to a point where I might want to adjust maybe around frame 60, adjust his head position. So I'll select his head joint and I'll hit E for rotate, and I'll just rotate that straight down as if he's kind of just looking down at the ground. Now notice I'm only editing that one keyframe on his head bone at frame 60. So when I start to scrub back, you can see how his head pops back into that original position. And then on frame 60, I'll pop back down and then back up. So what I can do now is open up the curve editor and continue modifying this animation. So I'll choose the head bone, and let's kind of scooch this down. And I'm going to choose the rotation yaw. And notice this is the keyframe that I adjusted. So you can see how different that value is. So in order to make a little bit more sense of this curve editor, I'm going to hold down Shift and Alt and right mouse drag to kind of stretch it out. And then I'll also just click on the right mouse key button to track and move over. And so now I can kind of see, how this curve is formed, and I can see the value that I adjusted. So basically what I want to maintain these proportions, but it's just I want to move it to this value. So I can do a couple things. First, I'm going to left mouse drag to create a marquee selection around all these keyframes. And I'm going to click on this button, which opens up the curve editor. And so I can just kind of come in here and check on simplify. I'll keep the settings, the tolerance set to 0.1, and hit apply. So notice the curve is still preserved, the original shape, but some of the keyframes that are unnecessary have been removed. And now, like I said, I just want to be able to move this shape, these proportions, and this movement to just this different value to match. So to do so, I'm going to hold down Shift and middle mouse button drag to move it up. And when I scrub, I can see, his head is still down and he's still kind of maintaining the movements. Now, of course, when we get to this point, his head's going to pop up. So we can do some more work there. But before we do that, I just want to show you something to be aware of. If you're going to make adjustments to keys in the way that I did, where you select them and move them up and down, you want to make sure this button, toggle value snapping, is turned off. So if I turn this on and move it, watch what happens. So when I hold down Shift and middle mouse drag, you can see that it's basically just trying to snap to the grid. And of course, it's no longer in that shape of that curve. So I'll click on undo, and reselect it. Hold down Alt and Control again and kind of zoom in to where I was. And so now we're back to where we were. Cool. So I'm going to make sure to turn that off just for the time being. So now I just want to kind of edit and correct this snapping that's happening. So I can just come in here and kind of start to adjust and delete the keyframes that I don't really need. So I might delete these keyframes. I might shift select these two keyframes and flatten them to kind of have a nicer ease in and ease out. And so let's see how this looks when I hit play. So that's a lot smoother. So this is one example of how to use the FK control rig and come in and modify the keyframes on each specific frame for each specific bone. So that's one way. Let me kind of get back to the original. Let's just go ahead and delete him and kind of start from scratch. So I'll drag him in, add him to my sequencer, and I'll add in that jog, stop, talk. So now we're kind of back to square one. Okay, so similar to what we did using the FK control rig, now we're going to try a little bit slightly easier and quicker way to make adjustments, which is using an additive layer with the FK control rig. So rather than going in and editing individual keys like we just previously did, you can build on top of that pre-existing animation, which remains preserved. So this is especially great, just like in the last case, if you just want to do a quick repositioning of an arm or a head like we're about to do in this case. So I'm going to click on this plus track and choose Control Rig, FK Control Rig. And then I'm going to right click and choose Additive. And so now you can see when I scrub, I can see this is the base animation that we're going to be building on top of. He does kind of run off of our plane, so I'll just expand that a bit. So again, let's say we want his head to be adjusted. So I can navigate to where I want to make sure I maintain his head position. So by around frame 66, I do want his head to be exactly in this position. So I'm going to set a keyframe. And then basically from frame 60 and everything prior, I want his head to be rotated down as if he's looking at the ground. So at frame 60, if I rotate his head down, that's going to affect everything prior as well. So now his head is kind of just tilted down. And then because we have, about a 6-frame transition where that movement is interpolated automatically, we get that nice smooth transition to where he's looking up. So as you can see, this is especially fast and easy instead of having to kind of go in and modify individual keys and kind of jumping into that curve editor. So the final example of how we can use Control Rig to edit the animation is, let's say in this case, where we see that his foot is kind of crashing through the ground. So FK Control Rig is not going to help us out in this scenario because, of course, he has IK legs. So if I select this foot and I try moving it, clearly that's not going to work in this case. But we do have that control rig that we already created, and it includes this backwards solve logic. So what that means is that we can utilize that control rig inversion and bake the control rig onto the skeletal mesh. And then from there, we can make edits with those control curves, and we'll be able to make adjustments to his IK legs, which is something, of course, we can't do with that FK control rig. So let's go ahead and get that set up. So I'll go back and add in that animation. So here he is jogging. He's just a skeletal mesh. But now let's actually use that control rig to help us out. And we're going to bake that control rig onto him, and then we can use those control curves to edit the animation. So to do that, I will right-click on the skeletal mesh and go to Bake to Control Rig. And in this list, this will show all of the available control rigs that we can apply to the character. So I will choose this one. Again, I want to make sure that Reduce Keys is unchecked, and I'll click Bake to Control Rig. And now again, you can see all of the different controls, and they have a keyframe on every single frame for every single control. and the animation is completely preserved, and I can make those individual edits as needed. So let's take a look at that foot that's crashing through the ground. So I'm going to actually pop open the curve editor, and I'm going to choose the location X for the foot. I'll hold down Shift and Alt and right mouse click drag, and also just right mouse click to track. But dragging while Shift and Alt are held down will just allow me to kind of expand and zoom and scale into this curve. So I just want to kind of investigate what's happening at this keyframe here. Now I just had click F, so that really zoomed me in and framed in on that specific spot. So if I select, let's say just these two keyframes, I hold down W and I middle mouse drag down while holding Shift, I can see this is the value where it needs to be to not crash through the ground. And so I can kind of come back here and I can kind of clean up these curves. Maybe select these guys. I could select those two and set them as like a flat tangent. And then now this keyframe is a problem. So I can scrub this down, pull this down. I can also make that more of a spline curve instead of a linear curve. And so now I can see that foot is no longer crashing. I might want to have it a little bit higher off the ground so I can kind of pull that down. Maybe even delete that key. So now no longer is crashing through the ground, and let's kind of see how this plays back. So I'll kind of make this a little bit smaller. And cool. So, I mean, it's a bit fast, and so that's something we could work on in terms of timing, but at least we've corrected the foot crashing through the ground. And so let's say now we are happy with this animation, and we want to bake this out again. So it's the same exact process that we did in the previous module. We'll right-click on the skeletal mesh and go to Bake Animation Sequence. I'll navigate to my animation folder, and I'll name this SCK_anim_jog stop talk version 2 and hit OK. And when this menu pops up, I'll just keep all the settings and click on Export to Animation Sequence. And then again, I can delete the control rig, and we can just kind of start from scratch. I can pull in this character again, add them to sequencer, and then I can search for stop, and I'll choose that version 2 with the corrected foot. And when I hit play, hit spacebar, I can see that his foot no longer crashes through the ground, which is perfect. So as you can see, editing your animation directly in Engine has become much easier and allows you to work even faster.